They said she would die on that land, not because they were cruel, but because they had seen dozens of men stronger, wealthier, and more experienced than herself fail on this very barren land. A young woman, unmarried, penniless, and inexperienced, inherited an abandoned ranch in the scorching heat of Texas. The powerful lined up waiting for her to fall. But they forgot one thing. Sometimes the one who doesn't know they can't win is the last one standing. Like and comment with the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because this story has only just begun. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Rowan Hale would later remember as the last ordinary day of her life. She was working the counter at Dellner's dry goods store in Cutter's Bend when the post rider came through, and the envelope he dropped onto the counter had her name written in her grandfather's shaky hand. The same hand that had once taught her to braid rope and read weather clouds and tell the difference between a snake that would kill you and one that was just scared. Elias Hale had been 81 years old, and his hands had been shaking for the last 4 of those years, but he'd kept writing her letters anyway. Short ones, mostly. Updates about the weather, complaints about his knees, occasional observations about the stupidity of neighboring ranchers, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who had never once second-guessed himself. This letter was longer than usual. She read it twice standing at the counter, then folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron. She finished her shift. She walked home to the 2-room house she rented from Mrs. Calloway on the eastern edge of town. She sat down at her small kitchen table, unfolded the letter again, and read it a 3rd time. By the time you read this, I expect I'll be gone. Don't go spending money on a funeral if it's already been paid. The ranch is yours now. Every acre, every fence post, every trough and broken gate. I know what people are going to say. They've been saying it to me for 20 years. Don't listen to them. Listen to the land. It's still talking, even if nobody's been paying attention. Elias. Her grandfather was dead, and he had left her the Hale Ranch book. 340 acres of dried-out, depleted Texas rangeland that hadn't turned a profit in longer than Rowan could remember, located 40 miles southwest of Cutter's Bend in a flat, wind-scoured basin that locals called the Scald, on account of the way the summer heat reflected up off the pale clay soil and burned everything twice. She sat with that for a long time. She rode out to the ranch 3 days later, after arranging for someone to cover her shifts and packing what she owned into 2 saddlebags and a canvas roll. The road southwest was one she hadn't traveled in 6 years, not since her last visit to Elias, and she noticed immediately that the land along that corridor had changed, dried out further, more cracked at the surface. The creek beds she remembered as children's swimming holes now reduced to shallow smears of damp clay. The ranch itself appeared at the end of a 2-track dirt road that cut through a stand of scrub mesquite, and when Rowan saw it for the first time in 6 years, she felt something complicated move through her chest. Not grief exactly, though that was part of it. More like the specific sadness of recognizing that something you loved had quietly been falling apart while you weren't watching. The main house was a low, square structure of weathered timber that had once been painted red and was now the color of old rust. 2 of the 4 corral posts on the near side had come down, and the wire they'd supported lay in a tangle in the dirt. The barn roof had a section missing near the western gable, visible even from the road. The windmill that pumped water from the underground cistern was turning in the dry wind, but the sound it made, a rhythmic metallic squeal, suggested the bearing needed grease or replacing or possibly both. She rode up to the house and dismounted, tied her horse to a fence post that at least appeared solid, and stood in the yard for a while just looking at it. A man came around from the side of the barn. He was somewhere in his 50s, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and ate irregularly, with a gray stubbled jaw and the bowed legs of a lifelong horseman. He stopped when he saw her, and his expression did several things in quick succession. Surprise, assessment, something that wasn't quite unfriendly, but wasn't quite welcoming either. "You'd be Elias's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Rowan Hale," she said. "And you are?" "Clem Duval. I worked for your grandfather going on 14 years. Still here, because there wasn't anywhere to go and nobody told me to leave." He paused. "Figured you'd sell." I haven't decided anything yet, Rowan said. Clem looked at her with the measured patience of a man accustomed to waiting on other people's decisions. Come on then, he said. I'll show you around. It'll go faster if I just tell you what's broke, instead of letting you find it yourself. What was broken was nearly everything. The inventory that Clem walked her through over the next 2 hours was delivered without editorial comment, just facts, which she appreciated. The roof needed significant repair. The windmill bearing needed replacing. 3 of the 6 water troughs were cracked and no longer holding. The eastern fence line had been cut. Clem used the word cut with a careful precision that suggested he didn't think it had happened by accident and not repaired. The small bunkhouse behind the main structure had 2 men living in it, Clem himself and a younger hand named Pete Sully, who was 19 years old and had arrived the previous spring looking for work and had somehow never left. What about cattle? Rowan asked. Clem's expression shifted just slightly. Well, he said, that's a thing. He led her south from the main structures, past the broken corral, and along a dry wash that ran toward the back of the property, where the land opened into a broad, shallow basin ringed by scrub oak and thorny brush. And there, grazing on what looked like nothing, on what Rowan would have sworn was bare dirt and dry grass stems, were cattle. Not many, maybe 30, 35 head. They were unmistakable even to someone who hadn't worked cattle in years. The broad, sloping shoulders, the distinctive angular faces, and above all, the horns, long, sweeping, dramatic, the kind of horns that made other cattle look like they'd been designed by committee. Texas Longhorns, a breed that had been the foundation of the state's cattle economy 30 years earlier, and had since been methodically replaced by beefier, more commercially profitable breeds that put on weight faster and were easier to handle. Rowan stood at the edge of the basin and watched them for a while. They grazed with a slow, unhurried confidence that seemed almost indifferent to the dryness around them. How long have they been here? She asked. Most of them were here when I came, Clem said. Your grandfather kept them. People thought he was sentimental. Maybe he was. But they survived that bad summer 3 years back when Henderson's Herefords all dropped weight and half of Patterson's Angus herd got sick. These ones just, he shrugged, kept going. How many did he start with? About the same. Maybe a few more. Lost some over the years. Couple to predators, couple went through a fence section during a bad storm and didn't come back. But they breed, and they don't need much, and they don't die easy. He paused. They're not worth what good beef cattle are worth. Not by a long measure. I know, Rowan said. She kept watching the cattle. One of them, a large brindle cow with horns that had to span 5 feet, lifted her head and looked back at Rowan with large, calm eyes, then went back to grazing. How much water does the cistern hold when it's full? Rowan asked. Enough, if the pump's working. Fix the pump first, Rowan said. Then we'll talk about the fence. Clem looked at her for a moment. You're staying then? I'm staying, she said. The word got back to town faster than she would have expected, which meant someone had been watching the road or Clem had let something slip in Perdido Wells, the nearest settlement, when he went for supplies. By the end of the week, she'd had 2 visitors. The first was a man named Gerald Whitmore, who arrived in a polished buggy with a younger man driving and introduced himself with the practiced warmth of someone who had made a great deal of money being liked. He was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with a hat that probably cost more than Rowan made in 2 months at the dry goods store. He ran Whitmore Cattle, which controlled about 12,000 acres in the surrounding county, along with several water rights and a couple of grazing leases that effectively shaped where every other rancher in the region could and couldn't run their herds. He stood in her yard and smiled at her and told her he was sorry about Elias, who he called a fine old man. Then he told her he'd been meaning to reach out about the property for some time, that it abutted his southern range in a way that created certain complications for his own operation, and that he would be willing to offer her a fair price for it. He named a figure. Rowan thanked him and said she wasn't interested in selling. His smile stayed fixed, but something behind his eyes adjusted. Miss Hale, he said, with the careful patience of a man recalibrating his approach, I don't think you've had time to fully understand what you've inherited. The land is depleted. The infrastructure is in poor condition. The cattle your grandfather kept are a sentimental holdover that won't generate anything close to viable income. Ranching is a hard business under the best circumstances. This property is not a best circumstance. I appreciate the assessment, Rowan said. I'm still not selling. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded with the gracious finality of a man who had fully expected this answer and had already decided what to do next. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. He climbed back into his buggy. And you will, he said pleasantly, and his driver turned the rig around and headed back down the two-track road. The second visitor was less cordial. A man named Dolph Garrett ran a mid-sized cattle operation about 6 miles to the northwest, on land that shared a section of boundary with the Hale property. He was younger than Whitmore, maybe 40, and he arrived on horseback with 2 of his hands behind him, which was either habit or a form of statement. He told her in flat, direct terms that her grandfather had, in his final years, been lax about keeping his cattle off the shared grazing territory along the northern draw, and that he expected this to change. My grandfather's cattle have been ranging that draw for as long as he owned this land, Rowan said. Your grandfather had arrangements that I tolerated out of courtesy, Garrett said. I'm telling you now, those arrangements don't carry over. What kind of arrangements are you referring to? Miss Hale. He said her name the way some men said girl, not in tone, but in intent. You don't know how any of this works. I'm giving you fair warning before something becomes a problem. Take it as the good faith it's offered in. He rode back out without waiting for her response. That night, Rowan sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned down to save oil and looked at the land map her grandfather had kept in a wooden box under the bed, a hand-drawn survey, decades old, with the property lines marked in faded ink and the features of the land labeled in Elias's small, precise handwriting. The northern draw that Garrett was laying claim to was marked clearly on the Hale side of the property boundary. There was no ambiguity in the map. She folded it carefully and put it back in the box. She was going to need to figure out a great many things, and she was going to need to figure them out before she ran out of money, which based on her current accounting was somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 months away. The state of her finances was a problem she hadn't let herself think about too directly in those first days because she'd needed to focus on what could be fixed first. But that night, she spread her accounting out on the table and looked at it clearly. She had $73 and some change to her name. The dry goods store had paid her advance wages when she explained her situation, which accounted for most of that. The ranch itself had no income, no cash reserves, no livestock worth selling at current prices. The Longhorns, her grandfather's 30-some-odd Longhorns, were the only animals on the property, and the market price for Longhorns was a fraction of what you'd get for Angus or Hereford. She had 2 hands, Clem and Pete, both of whom she needed, and neither of whom had been paid in some weeks. Clem waved that off when she raised it. Elias always made it right eventually, he said, but she felt the weight of it. She needed the fences repaired. She needed the roof patched before the fall rains came. She needed feed supplemented through whatever dry stretch was coming, which the look of the sky told her was going to be a long one. She needed at some point to actually generate some income. The bank in Cutter's Bend was the logical first stop. She rode in on a Thursday and met with a man named Lloyd Presswick, who was the bank's loan officer and who received her in a small office with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had already decided the answer before the question was asked. He looked at her paperwork. He looked at her. He expressed sympathy about her grandfather. He explained, with the gentle regret of a man delivering a verdict he personally disagreed with, that the bank's current policy regarding agricultural lending required collateral of a type and value that the Hale property, in its present condition, did not meet. What if the property were improved? Rowan asked. That's something we could revisit in the future, Presswick said, which was a polite way of saying nothing at all. She thanked him and left. She sat on her horse outside the bank for a minute, calculating. Then she rode to the other end of town where a man named Harv Osman ran a feed and supply operation and was known to extend credit on occasion to ranchers he trusted, and she had a conversation with him that was more productive. Osman had known her grandfather for 40 years. He agreed to extend her credit on feed and fencing supplies for 90 days, which wasn't much time but was better than nothing. She also, in a move she hadn't originally planned, stopped in at the town's small newspaper office and left a notice that she was willing to hire day labor for fence repair, offering meals and fair daily wages, payment deferred 2 months. 3 men showed up at the ranch the following week. Check. The work that first month was the kind that left her hands raw and her back aching in ways she hadn't experienced since she was young, and helping Elias with whatever he needed done on her summer visits. She worked alongside the hired men, and Clem and Pete, not because it was expected of her, but because it was faster, and because she found that people worked harder when they didn't feel alone in the effort. The pump bearing was replaced first, as she'd instructed. Water flow to the troughs was restored. The eastern fence line, the one Clem had described as cut, was reinforced with new wire and posts, and when she walked the line herself, she found 3 separate sections that showed clean cuts rather than corrosion breaks or animal damage. Someone had done this deliberately. She didn't know yet if it had been Garrett's people, or someone connected to Whitmore, or just an opportunist taking advantage of an old man's declining ability to manage his own land. She filed it away. The roof patch was rougher work, patching rather than replacing, using materials salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding at the back of the property. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would hold through the season. All the while, the Longhorns ranged. She spent time with them, not managing them exactly, because they didn't need much managing, but watching them, learning how they moved, where they went in the heat of the day, toward the draw, where a thin ribbon of shade ran along the base of the brush line, where they grazed in the early morning, the flat middle section of the basin, how they interacted with each other. They were not gentle animals. There were hierarchies among them, enforced with the kind of direct, unhurried authority that came from horns that could do real damage. But they were also, in a way she found difficult to articulate, deeply competent. They found food where other cattle would stand and wait for someone to bring it. They found shade. They found water. They asked for almost nothing. One evening, Clem found her sitting on a fence rail watching them come in toward the water trough, and he came and leaned against the rail nearby and watched with her. "You're thinking something," he said after a while. "I'm thinking about range," she said. "They're working this basin over too much. If we keep them concentrated here, they'll strip it out." Clem was quiet for a moment. "You want to open up the grazing?" "The back section's been fallow for years. The land north of the draw, before Garrett's boundary. That's unused too. And the flats east of the mesquite stand." She was looking at the map in her memory, which she'd studied often enough now that she could see it clearly, even without it in front of her. "If we rotate them through sections, instead of letting them run one area down, the grass might come back. Traditional management would say, keep them where you can watch them." "Traditional management built traditional results," Rowan said. "We don't have land good enough for that to work." Clem picked at a loose piece of rail wood. "The fence lines aren't set up for rotation. We'd need to run new wire, build temporary crossings." "I know. That's money and labor we don't have a lot of." "I know that too." He was quiet again. Then, "Your grandfather talked about doing something like this. 15 years ago, maybe. Said the land needed to breathe. Everybody told him he was wrong." "What happened?" "He got sick that winter, bad enough that he couldn't push it through. By the time he was better, the moment had passed." Clem paused. "He always thought he should have done it anyway." Rowan looked out at the cattle making their slow way toward water. The big brindle cow was at the front of the loose group, as she usually was, moving with the patient authority of something that had survived a long time by being smarter than circumstances. "We'll start small," Rowan said. "Divide the basin with a temporary line. Give the east half a rest period. See what happens." "And if nothing happens?" "Then we've wasted some wire," she said. "We've been wasting things already. At least this would be on purpose." The first 6 weeks were hard in ways she'd anticipated and hard in ways she hadn't. She'd anticipated the physical difficulty, the fence work, the water management, the constant repair of things that kept breaking because the infrastructure was old and underfunded. She'd anticipated the financial pressure, the careful rationing of resources, the arithmetic she did in her head every morning when she woke up before dawn. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the social difficulty of being exactly what she was, a young woman, alone, running a ranch, in a community where that particular combination was viewed as either pitiable or faintly absurd. She heard it in the way men at the feed store talked over her to Clem if Clem happened to come along. She heard it in the questions from neighboring ranch wives who visited with food and goodwill and couldn't quite help asking how long she planned to keep at it, as if the question of duration was the most relevant one. She heard it most directly in the comments that circulated back to her through Pete, who was 19 and not yet sophisticated enough to know when he was delivering gossip. "Mr. Henderson said she'll be sold out by fall," Pete reported one evening, without seeming to realize that this might be uncomfortable for her to hear. "What do you think?" she asked him. Pete chewed on that for a moment. He was a gangly young man, all wrists and elbows, with a face that hadn't quite grown into itself yet, and he had a habit of looking slightly to the side when he was thinking seriously about something. "I think the Longhorns are eating better than they were last month," he said finally. "That east half of the basin is coming back. You can see the new growth." "Good," she said. "I didn't say I thought she was wrong," he added, apparently feeling that he should clarify this point. "I know you didn't, Pete." He nodded, satisfied. "Okay then." The new growth was real. After 3 weeks of giving the east half of the basin a rest period, keeping the herd in the west half where there was more water access, she'd opened the east half back up, and the Longhorns had moved into it with an enthusiasm that said more than any survey could. There was grass coming back where the soil had looked near dead. Not much, not yet, but enough to matter. She started keeping notes on it in an old ledger she found in the house, recording which sections the cattle grazed, for how long, and what the condition of the land looked like after. It wasn't scientific exactly. She didn't have the training for that, but it was systematic, and it was hers, and she found that the act of writing it down helped her think. It was in the 7th week that Whitmore came back. This time, he didn't come himself. He sent a lawyer instead, a thin, formal man from Cutter's Bend named Ellsworth, who arrived with a leather case and a measured expression and offered her a contract. The numbers were slightly better than Whitmore's original figure. Not a lot, but slightly. "Mr. Whitmore understands this is a difficult time," Ellsworth said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee, "and he wants you to know that this offer is made in good faith and with genuine respect for your situation." "My situation is that I'm running a ranch," Rowan said. "Of course. And doing so admirably, I'm sure. But the economics of small-scale ranching in this region are difficult," she said. "Yes, I'm familiar with that." "Thank you." Ellsworth blinked. "The offer expires in 2 weeks." "Then in 2 weeks it expires," Rowan said. "Would you like some coffee before you ride back?" He declined the coffee. He rode back. The offer expired 2 weeks later without response. She found out, 3 days after the deadline passed, that Whitmore had been quietly in conversation with Dolph Garrett about a possible joint land arrangement, meaning that if she sold, Whitmore would acquire the property and Garrett would get expanded grazing access along the shared boundary. It wasn't criminal, just business, and the information reached her only because Harv Osman had overheard a conversation at his supply store and decided she ought to know. "Garrett's been in here twice," Osman told her, leaning on his counter with the casual delivery of a man sharing nothing in particular. "Both times he's been asking questions about water access on your property, specifically the North Cistern." "The North Cistern barely functions," Rowan said. "Doesn't matter what it does, matters what it is. Right of access to a water source in a dry year is worth more than the land itself sometimes." She thought about that on the ride home. Water. In this country, in this climate, everything came down to water eventually. She dug out the land map when she got back and looked at it again. The North Cistern sat on her property, but sat close to the boundary with Garrett's land. Close enough that in a bad year, whoever controlled it controlled the ability to graze that entire northern section. If Whitmore got her land and Garrett got the grazing access arrangement they'd apparently discussed, the practical effect would be that Garrett could run cattle north of the draw without ever needing to cross her property at all. And the water she controlled now would no longer be hers to control. She looked at the map for a long time. Then she put on her hat and went out to find Clem. "The North Cistern," she said. "What would it take to get it fully operational?" Clem wiped his hands on a rag and thought about it. "The pump itself is serviceable. The The collection pipe from the roof catch has a blockage somewhere. I've been meaning to clear it, but there were other things. Give me 2 days. Do it now, she said. And when it's running, I want a trough up there, full size. He looked at her. That's a fair piece of work. I know. Can Pete help? Pete can help with most of it. Then get started tomorrow. She paused. And Clem, if anyone comes by asking questions about that cistern or asking to take a look at the northern boundary for any reason, you come find me before you say anything to them, all right? He studied her. All right, he said. And I want you to move 20 head north of the draw as soon as the trough's up. Let them work that section. Leave sign that they've been ranging up there. The look he gave her now was different, sharper, more attentive. He was putting together what she was doing. Establishing use, he said. Establishing presence, she said, which is different and legal. He nodded slowly. Your grandfather would have liked this, he said. I don't know if he would have, she said honestly. He was a more patient man than I am, but it's what we've got. By the end of the second month, the thing she'd feared and half expected began to announce itself clearly. The drought was deepening. It had been dry when she arrived. It got drier. The shallow creek along the property's western edge, which Elias's map labeled hopefully as Cottonwood Run, had been reduced when she came to a thin trickle, and now it was a damp patch of darker-colored soil that would be indistinguishable from the surrounding ground within weeks if the sky didn't change. She watched other ranchers in the region beginning to feel it. Word came back through the network of supply runs and town visits. Henderson had already sold off a third of his herd because the feed costs were too high to carry them through. 2 smaller operators southeast of town had given up entirely, taken their cash, and moved on. Even Garrett, according to what Osmond told her, was pulling his southern grazing operation back toward the wetter sections of his property. Her Longhorns kept going. They ranged wider now that she'd been rotating them through more sections. They found things. Dry grass stems she would have sworn had no nutrition left in them, brush species that other cattle didn't bother with, patches of deeper soil near the old dry wash where the root systems held moisture longer. They lost a little condition, as any cattle would in a dry spell, but they didn't go hollow the way other breeds did. They moved when they needed to. They adapted. She watched this with a feeling that was not quite satisfaction. Too much was still uncertain for that. But something close to certainty, a slow, building conviction that she had not made the wrong bet. Pete came to her one afternoon while she was working on the ledger, filling in her notes from the week's observations. There's someone at the gate, he said. Who? Don't know her. Woman, maybe 40, riding a decent horse and looking like she's not sure if she should knock. Rowan put down the ledger and went outside. The woman at the gate was, as Pete had described, around 40, neatly dressed in practical traveling clothes, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work and had arrived at something fine on the other side of it. She was sitting her horse with the easy posture of someone who spent real time in the saddle, not the performed posture of someone trying to look like they did. Miss Hale, she called. That's right, Rowan said, walking toward the gate. My name's Ida Voss. My husband and I run a small operation out past Perdido Wells, though the Voss place, maybe you know it. Rowan didn't, but she nodded. I heard you've been rotating your Longhorns through rest periods. Is that true? Rowan looked at her. Where did you hear that? My supply man Harv Osmond mentioned it. I hope that's not... I didn't mean to pry into your business. She paused. We're in trouble with the drought. My husband doesn't want to sell the herd, but the feed cost is killing us, and the land is just... She gestured vaguely at the desiccated landscape around them. We had some Longhorn crosses years ago, but got talked out of them. I just wanted to see what you were doing, and if it was... She stopped herself. I'm sorry, this was probably not my business. Come in, Rowan said, unlatching the gate. I'll show you what I'm doing. I'll tell you what I know, which isn't a lot, but it's more than it was 2 months ago. Ida Voss rode in through the gate. She looked around at the property, the patched roof, the repaired fences, the utilitarian cleanliness of a place that was being held together by effort and not money. She looked at the basin where the Longhorns were working the afternoon's grazing. They look all right, she said quietly, with the practiced assessment of a rancher. Better than all right, Rowan said. Come on, I'll walk you through it. She walked Ida Voss through it for 2 hours. The rotation system, the rest periods, what the land looked like before, and what it was beginning to look like now. She showed her the ledger notes. She explained what she'd observed about the Longhorns' grazing behavior, their range, what they sought out, and what they left behind. She talked about the water management and the importance of the North Cistern. Ida listened with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes faster than her hands could write. At the end of it, they stood at the edge of the South Basin and watched the herd settle toward the late afternoon shade. This is going to work, Ida said. Not as a question. I think so, Rowan said. I don't know for certain. I can't know for certain yet. But you think so? I think so. Ida was quiet for a moment. I want to try this, she said. We've got 30 acres on our east end that we've been resting by accident because we couldn't afford the fence repair to get cattle back in there. What if we did it on purpose? What cattle do you have? Mixed herd. Some Angus cross, We've got 6 Longhorn cross cows we bought from a man who was selling off. Hadn't known what to do with them. Start there, Rowan said. Work the crosses separately from the Angus. Watch what they do differently. She paused. And come back in a month. Tell me what you see. Ida Voss nodded. She mounted her horse and then sat there for a moment, looking at Rowan with the direct assessment of someone making up her mind about something. People in town think you're going to fail, she said. I know. I don't think so, Ida said, for what it's worth. She rode out through the gate. Rowan latched it behind her and stood in the yard for a while after, listening to the windmill turning, the low sounds of cattle settling into evening, the dry wind moving through the mesquite. Her back ached. Her hands were rough and cracked at the knuckles. She had perhaps 3 months of credit and cash left before she would be in real trouble, and no certainty that anything she was doing would generate income in time. Whitmore was still out there, patient and well-funded, waiting for her to fail. Garrett was still pushing at the boundary questions. The drought was still deepening, but the east half of the basin was showing new growth. The North Cistern was running clean. The Longhorns had put on condition this past week for the first time since she'd arrived. She went inside to work on the ledger before the light ran out. She had a lot of notes to write. The ledger was nearly full by the end of the 3rd month. Rowan had started a second one, a newer book she'd bought from Osmond's supply store on her last run into Perdido Wells, and she was filling that one too. Not just with grazing observations now, but with numbers, projections, the careful arithmetic of a woman trying to build something from almost nothing while the clock ran in one direction only. The drought had not broken. If anything, the sky had taken on a quality she recognized from childhood visits to Elias. That particular hard, pale blue that meant the dry spell had stopped being a temporary condition and had decided to become a season. She was out checking the south boundary fence on a Wednesday morning when Pete came riding hard across the flats toward her, which was unusual enough that she stopped what she was doing and watched him come. Cattle missing, he said, pulling up short. His horse was blowing hard. Clem counted this morning. We're down 11 head. Rowan looked at him. Down from what? We had 38 as of last week. Clem counted 27 this morning. He's ridden the west section twice. Nothing. She didn't say anything for a moment. 11 head was not a random loss. Cattle didn't simply disappear from a fenced property in groups of 11. 1 or 2 going through a wire or wandering a draw. That happened. 11 meant something deliberate had happened. Show me where he found the count, she said. Dodd. The evidence was at the northwest corner of the property, where the fence line curved toward the boundary with Garrett's land. 2 posts had been pulled clean out of the ground. Not knocked over, not rotted through, but extracted, the way you'd do it with a come-along and a chain if you wanted to open a section without cutting wire and leaving marks. The wire itself was rolled back and re-staked loose enough to look intact from a distance, but loose enough to push through without trouble. Clem was crouched beside the post holes when she arrived, looking at the disturbed soil. Fresh, he said, without turning around. Done in the last 2 nights, I'd guess. No rain to settle the ground back. Rowan crouched beside him and looked at the post hole. The edges were clean. Someone who knew what they were doing, she said. Someone who's done it before. She stood and looked north, toward Garrett's land. You couldn't see his operation from here. The terrain folded and the scrub oak blocked the line of sight. But she'd ridden the boundary enough by now to know what was on the other side. Any tracks? Cattle tracks heading north through the gap, boot tracks and one set of horse prints. At least one man on foot to push the cattle, one on horseback. He paused. Could have been two on foot. Could Garrett's land hold 11 extra head without anyone noticing? Clem gave her a look that said he thought this was not a difficult question. Garrett runs close to 400 head. 11 longhorns disappear into that. You'd need to be looking specifically to find them. She stood there for a while, working it through. Going to the law was the obvious answer. The county sheriff operated out of a town called Red Rock, 30 miles east, and he was not known for moving quickly on property disputes between small ranchers and established operations. Garrett was an established operation. She was a woman 3 months into a failing ranch. She did not have high expectations for how that conversation would go. But she also couldn't say nothing. "Fix the fence," she told Clem. "I want posts set in concrete this time, whatever that costs. And I want you to ride the entire boundary every morning until further notice." "That's a lot of riding." "I know, do it anyway." She looked at the gap one more time. "I'm going to Red Rock." The sheriff of Red Rock County was a heavy-set man named Aldous Crane, who had been in the position long enough to have developed the specific fatigue of someone who has heard too many versions of the same argument from too many sides. He received Rowan in his office on a Thursday afternoon, listened to what she had to say with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes about 3 feet to the left of her face, and then asked if she had documentation of the missing cattle, brand records, count records, anything in writing. She had her ledger. She opened it on his desk and showed him the weekly counts, the entry from the previous week showing 38 head, the entry from that morning showing 27. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "Miss Hale," he said, "a rancher's own count book isn't. These numbers could represent natural loss. Animals go through fences, wander draws, get taken by predators." 11 head through a fence section that showed evidence of posts being deliberately pulled, she said. "That's your interpretation of a couple of loose posts." "It's my interpretation and Clem Duvall's interpretation, and Clem has been working cattle for 30 years. Crane leaned back in his chair. "I know Clem Duvall," he said. "I also know Dolph Garrett, and I know he runs a tight operation. I'm not saying nothing happened. I'm saying I can't ride onto a man's property on the basis of a count discrepancy and a couple of loose fence posts." "What would you need?" He thought about it, or appeared to. "Physical evidence, brand identification on cattle found on Garrett's property that match your registered brand. That'd be something." "And how do I get that without riding onto Garrett's property myself?" "You don't," is the short answer. She picked up her ledger and left without thanking him, which she would later think was probably not strategically wise, but was the only honest response available to her. Outside, she sat on her horse for a minute and thought about it. Then she rode to the county land records office, which was in a different building on the other end of Red Rock's main street, and she spent the better part of 2 hours pulling records. Property boundaries, water rights registrations, grazing lease documents. She was looking for anything that touched the shared boundary between the Hale property and Garrett's land, anything that would give her information she didn't already have. What she found, buried in a filing from 11 years back, was a grazing access registration that Garrett had filed claiming use rights over a section of land that, according to her grandfather's survey map, fell inside the Hale property boundary. It was a thin claim, the kind of thing that only mattered if you pursued it, but someone had filed it, and it was sitting in the county records as if it were established fact. She had the clerk make her a copy. She paid the copying fee with money she could barely spare. She rode home with the document in her saddlebag. See, the weeks that followed were the hardest stretch she'd had since arriving. The 11 cattle didn't come back. She couldn't prove they were on Garrett's land. She couldn't prove anything to a standard that Crane would act on, and she had begun to suspect that even if she could, the outcome wouldn't be what she needed. Garrett had been in this county longer than she'd been alive. He had relationships that she didn't and leverage she couldn't match. What she had was what she'd always had: the land, the Longhorns, and a system that was beginning, slowly, to show results. The problem was that slowly wasn't fast enough. Pete came to her on a Friday evening in the fourth month with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not his usual open, slightly uncertain face, but something tighter, more reluctant. "I got an offer," he said. She waited. "Garrett's foreman came by this afternoon while you and Clem were on the east section. He said they were looking for experienced hands and the pay was better than he figured I was getting here." Pete was looking at a point somewhere around her left shoulder. "He said the hail operation wasn't going to make it, and I should think about my future." Rowan looked at him for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." He finally looked at her directly. "I don't want to leave, but my mother's in Perdido Wells, and she's not been well, and I've got some debts from before I came here, and—" He stopped. "Is it going to make it? This place? Are we going to make it?" She could have given him a confident answer. She could have told him, yes, certainly. Things are turning around. Stay, and it'll be worth it. But she'd made a decision early on. It had felt like a moral decision at the time, though she wouldn't have called it that, not to tell people what they wanted to hear about the state of things. "I don't know," she said. "I think we will. I think what we're doing is working. But I've got maybe 2 more months before the money runs out, and a lot has to go right in those 2 months for us to still be here in the fall." Pete was quiet. "If you need to go," she said, "I won't hold it against you. That's a real choice you're making, not a betrayal." He chewed on the inside of his cheek for a moment. "If I stay," he said slowly, "and it works, what's in it for me?" It was the most direct thing he'd ever said to her, and she found herself respecting it. "A wage and a stake," she said. "If this place becomes profitable, you get a percentage of what you helped build. In writing, if you want." He thought about this with the visible effort of someone doing actual arithmetic. "In writing would be good," he said finally. "Then in writing it is." He nodded. "I'll stay," he said, and went off to deal with the evening water check. And that was the end of that conversation. The route along the northern draw became a problem in the 5th month. Rowan had been rotating a portion of the herd through the section north of the dry wash, the land that sat between her northern boundary and the scrub oak line, and had been doing so with enough regularity that it was clearly established as part of her operation. But in the 5th month she arrived one morning to find the access point blocked. Not dramatically, not cut wire or pulled posts, but a row of fresh-set stakes had appeared overnight along a line that cut across what she considered her grazing route, at a point that was, depending on whose survey you used, either just inside Garrett's land or just inside hers. The stakes had a strip of orange cloth tied to each one. She pulled one out of the ground and looked at it. Then she put it back, rode back to the ranch, and got the county map copy she'd made in Red Rock. The stakes were on her land, by 40 feet, based on the county survey, but 40 feet was 40 feet. She pulled every one of them out and stacked them neatly beside the fence line. She left the stack where anyone riding that boundary would find it. Garrett came 3 days later. He came alone this time, which she hadn't expected. She was at the trough checking the pump connection when she heard his horse coming up the 2-track, and she straightened up and watched him ride in and dismount with the unhurried authority of a man who was accustomed to arriving wherever he arrived and having that mean something. "Those stakes marked a boundary survey I commissioned," he said, instead of good morning. "Your survey puts your boundary 40 feet inside my property line, according to the county records," she said. "I have the documents if you want to compare them." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before on men who had expected an easier conversation. "Surveys can be wrong." "They can," she agreed. "If yours is wrong, you file a correction with the county land office. In the meantime, I'll be using the land that's mine according to the existing documentation." A long pause. A dry wind moved between them. "You found that grazing claim I filed," he said. She hadn't confirmed it to him, but he'd clearly assumed it, which told her he knew exactly what he'd done and had been watching to see if she found it. "I did," she said. "That claim was filed in good faith." "In good faith on land that belongs to this ranch," she said. "I'm going to request a formal review of it through the county office. You're welcome to contest it." His jaw moved. He was not a man accustomed to this kind of conversation with this kind of person, and the adjustment he was making in real time was visible in his face. "You're making enemies you don't need," he said. "Whitmore is patient. I'm not particularly patient, and the two of us together can make this very difficult for you." "You're already making it difficult for me," she said. 11 of my cattle walked off this property through a fence section with pulled posts, and the direction they walked was north. Dead silence. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "I'm sure you don't," she said. "Is there anything else?" He mounted his horse. He looked at her from that height for a moment, and she held his eyes without any particular effort because she found she wasn't scared of him. Not because he wasn't dangerous, she thought he probably was, but because being scared of him wouldn't change anything. "You're going to run out of road," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Good day, Mr. Garrett." He rode out. Rowan stood in the yard and let out a breath that was longer than she'd realized she'd been holding. 2 weeks later, the banks turned her down a second time. She'd gone back to Prestwick and Cutter's Bend with more documentation, the ledger records, a written summary of the rotation system and what it was producing, a projected income estimate based on the rate at which the herd was expanding and the current Longhorn market price. It was, she thought, a reasonable case for a modest loan. Not large, enough to extend her operating window by 2 months and fund the next phase of fence work. Prestwick read through everything carefully. He asked several questions, and then he told her, with genuine regret that she thought might actually be genuine, that the board had decided they couldn't extend credit against an operation with no current income and uncertain future prospects. "What about collateral?" she asked. "The land itself." "The land value in its current state." He stopped. "The board's assessment of the property's value is lower than the loan amount you're requesting." "Lower based on what?" He hesitated, just slightly. "An appraisal commissioned by the bank." "Who conducted the appraisal?" Another hesitation, slightly longer. "A firm out of Red Rock that the bank uses regularly." She thought about who in Red Rock would be connected to Whitmore's business operations, but she didn't say it. There was no point. Even if she was right, it couldn't be proven quickly enough to matter. She rode home in a state of controlled fury that she expressed by working the fence line for 4 straight hours without stopping, until Clem came out and told her she was going to pull something, and then she'd be no use to anyone. "How much time do we have?" he asked, sitting on a post while she took water. 6 weeks if I'm careful. 8 if something changes." He nodded slowly. "The Voss woman came by while you were gone." Rowan looked up. Ida Voss had come back twice since that first visit, each time with observations about her own small operation, asking questions and offering information in the careful way of someone who wasn't sure how much she was entitled to ask for. What did she want? She said she has a buyer asking about Longhorn calves. A man out of San Antonio who's building a small heritage herd. She said if you have calves to sell, she could make the introduction. Rowan stood still. This was the thing she'd been calculating toward but hadn't wanted to count on. A market path for the calves that would begin arriving as the herd expanded. She'd had 3 calves born in the past 6 weeks, with more coming. They were too young to sell now. But in another 2 months... "How serious is the buyer?" she asked. Ida seemed to think serious enough. She put the water canteen down and picked up the fence tool again. "Write to her tonight," she said. "Tell her I want to talk to the buyer directly. And tell her," she thought, "tell her I'd like to visit her operation. I want to see what her Longhorn crosses are doing." "Why?" "Because if we can show a buyer not just our herd, but a second operation running the same system and getting results, that's a stronger case than one ranch." She worked the wire. "And because Ida Voss has been sharing information with me from the start, and I haven't given her enough back." Clem was quiet for a moment, then, "You know Whitmore's been talking to the grain operators in Perdido Wells. Word is he's trying to get them to cut off your credit line with Osman." She kept working the wire. She'd wondered how long before he tried that angle. "Osman won't do it," she said. "You sure?" "No, but he's known my grandfather 40 years. I'll ride in tomorrow and talk to him directly." "And if Whitmore's already gotten to him?" She pulled the wire taut and locked it off. "Then I'll figure out the next thing," she said. "Same as everything else." Osmond had not been gotten to. He received her in his back office the following morning with the expression of a man who had already heard what she was coming to ask about and had already made up his mind. "Whitmore sent someone," he said before she could speak. "Offered to give me a preferential contract on supply orders if I called your credit." She waited. "I told him," Osmond said, "that I'd been in business in this county for 32 years on the basis of doing what I said I'd do, and that his preferential contract wasn't worth the paper it was on if the word got around that I'd cut a customer off for the right price." He paused. "Your credit stands." She let out a breath. "Thank you, Harv." "Don't thank me. Just make sure you can pay eventually." He leaned back. "I also want you to know that the way Whitmore's been moving, the bank, the grazing claims, trying to squeeze your supply line, that's not a man who thinks you're going to fail on your own. That's a man who's making sure of it. You understand the difference?" "I understand," she said. "A man who was sure you'd fail would just wait," Osmond said. "He wouldn't be spending money and favors to hurry it along. That means what you're doing out there is worrying him." He gave her a long look over the bridge of his nose. "Worth knowing." She rode home with that sitting in her chest alongside everything else. The depleted finances, the missing cattle, the land dispute, the bank's refusal. Worth knowing. It didn't fix any of those things, but it reshaped them, just slightly, into something she could use. That evening, she spread her papers on the table again. The ledger, the land map, the county document copy, her projection numbers. And she sat with them for a long time, reorganizing what she knew into what she needed to do next. She wrote a letter to Ida Voss's buyer in San Antonio. She wrote another letter to the County Land Records Office requesting a formal boundary review. She wrote a third letter to a different bank, a smaller institution in a town called Ferris, 60 miles south, that she'd heard mentioned once in a conversation at Osmond's store as being willing to consider non-traditional agricultural lending. She didn't know if any of it would work. She knew that she was not out of moves. The herd was 29 head now. She'd lost 11 to whatever Garrett had done, but 3 calves had been born, and 2 young steers she hadn't counted correctly before had turned up in the back section. 29 head of Longhorns that were, by any honest assessment, in better condition now than when she'd arrived. The East Basin section was producing real grass again. Not lush, not the kind you'd see in a wet year, but real, growing grass that was coming back because the land had been given time to breathe. She closed the ledger and blew out the lamp. 6 weeks? Maybe 8. Somewhere in that window, something had to break in her direction. She'd done everything she could think of to make that more likely and less dependent on luck. The rest was out of her hands, and she'd never been good at accepting that, and she accepted it anyway because there was nothing else to do. Outside, the windmill turned in the dark, steady as a heartbeat. The letter from the bank in Ferris arrived on a Monday, which was the same day the water stopped. Not all of it. The south cistern was still running, and the trough system Clem had repaired in the first weeks still held what it held. But the north cistern, the one she'd invested real effort and real money into getting operational, the one that fed the upper trough where 20 head of her herd drank every morning, ran dry between midnight and dawn with no warning and no obvious explanation. Clem found it when he did the morning rounds, stood looking at the empty trough, with his hands on his hips and his hat pushed back on his head, and then came to find her before breakfast. She read the Ferris Bank letter first, because she needed to know what she was working with before she dealt with anything else. The letter was short and professional and told her that after reviewing her application, the bank was unable to extend credit at this time, but wished her well in her endeavors. And she set it on the table and sat with it for exactly 1 minute before she folded it and put it in the box where she kept documents she wasn't done with yet. Then she went to look at the north cistern. The cistern itself was intact, no cracking, no visible damage to the housing. The collection pipe from the roof catch was clear. She'd had Clem clean it out weeks ago. The feed line that ran from the underground water table to the cistern base was where the problem was. She could see it when she crouched down and pulled the inspection cover. The line had been blocked. Not collapsed, not corroded. Blocked deliberately, with a plug of packed clay and gravel shoved deep enough into the pipe that the water pressure alone wouldn't clear it. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. "Someone did this," Pete said from behind her. He'd followed her out and was looking over her shoulder with the expression of a young man encountering something that confirmed a fear he'd been carrying for a while. "Yes," she said. "Garrett? I don't know." And she genuinely didn't. It could have been Garrett's people. It could have been someone connected to Whitmore. It could have been someone either of them had paid to do it without leaving a direct line back. It doesn't matter who right now. What matters is fixing it. How do you fix a blocked pipe you can't reach? She stood up. "You dig," she said. "Oh." They dug for 2 days. It was the worst kind of work. Not physically dramatic, just relentlessly grinding, chopping through hard clay soil in the Texas heat, with the knowledge that every hour the north section of the herd was going without reliable water. She moved those 20 heads south to share the main trough, which put pressure on the south cistern and created overcrowding that she didn't like and couldn't avoid. Clem worked the dig with her. Pete worked it. A man named Roscoe Fitch, who'd been one of the day laborers she'd hired for the early fence work and had kept coming back for occasional jobs, showed up on the second morning without being asked and picked up a shovel. "Nobody called you," Clem told him. "I know," Roscoe said, and kept digging. They cleared the blockage late on the second afternoon, a compacted mass of clay, gravel, and what turned out to be a section of old burlap sacking, all of it packed tight enough that it had taken serious effort to get in there. Someone had put real time into this. It wasn't an amateur act of sabotage. It was the kind of thing done by someone who knew water systems and knew what they were doing. The line cleared. The cistern began to refill. It would take another day to build back to operating pressure. That night, Rowan wrote to Sheriff Crane in Red Rock again, a second letter, more detailed than the first, documenting the blocked water line alongside the earlier fence tampering and the missing cattle. She wrote it carefully, in her most precise handwriting, citing dates and describing the physical evidence in specific terms. She wasn't writing it because she expected Crane to act. She was writing it because she wanted the record to exist, to be dated, to be on file somewhere outside her own ledger. She also, in the same sitting, wrote a letter to a lawyer in Cutter's Bend named Harmon Bryce, whose name she'd gotten from Osmond. Not a famous man, not a powerful one, but someone Osmond described as careful and honest, which was what she needed. She told Bryce what she had: the county boundary documents, the fraudulent grazing claim, the record of incidents. She asked what she could do with it. She sealed both letters and put them in her saddlebag to mail the next morning. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a while, doing the arithmetic she did every night whether she wanted to or not. The Ferris Bank was closed to her. Osmond's credit line was still open, but she'd drawn on it further during the pipe repair. The San Antonio buyer, the man interested in Longhorn calves through Ida's connection, had written back expressing interest but hadn't committed to anything, and the calves she had wouldn't be ready for another 6 weeks at minimum. She was 4 weeks from the point where she would have to make a decision she didn't want to make. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window frame she kept meaning to fix. She went to bed. Mold. The break she'd been working toward came from an unexpected direction, the way most things did. Ida Voss rode in on a Thursday morning leading a man on a second horse, a compact, quietly dressed man in his late 40s named Samuel Draper, who turned out to be not the San Antonio buyer himself, but the buyer's ranch manager, sent ahead to assess before his employer made the trip. Draper had the manner of someone who had spent his career making decisions other people would have to live with, and he had the eyes of someone who was very good at it. He didn't say much at first. He rode the property with Rowan for 2 hours, watching the cattle, watching the land, asking occasional precise questions about the rotation system that told her he already understood what she was doing and was checking her answers against his own assessment. He asked about the herd's overall condition during the drought. He asked about calf survival rates. He looked at her ledger when she offered it and spent 20 minutes going through the numbers with the focused attention of a man reading a language he was fluent in. "Your rotation records are thorough," he said. "I didn't know they'd be useful to anyone else when I started them," she said. "I kept them because I needed to know what was working. That's usually how useful records get made." He handed the ledger back. He looked out at the basin, where the brindle cow, the big one Rowan had been privately calling Duchess for months, though she'd never said that to Clem or Pete, was leading the afternoon movement toward shade with her usual unhurried authority. The condition of these animals relative to what we're seeing across the region right now is notable. The drought's been hard on everyone. It's been devastating on everyone, he corrected. Your herd looks like it hasn't noticed. They've noticed. They've just dealt with it. He nodded. Mr. Callahan, my employer, is building a Longhorn heritage operation on a ranch outside San Antonio. He's committed to it long term, which means he's not looking for one purchase. He's looking for a relationship with someone who can supply quality animals on a continuing basis and who knows what they're doing with the breed. He paused. I'm going to tell him to come see this himself. Rowan kept her expression neutral. When? 2 weeks? Maybe 3. He looked at her directly. Can you hold things together that long? She looked back at him with the same directness. Yes, she said. It was the truth, barely. She could hold it together that long. After that, she was less certain. She was 2 weeks from Draper's visit, 10 days actually, which felt tighter every morning, when everything caught fire. Not literally, not at first. The first sign of real trouble came at 4 in the morning when she was pulled out of sleep by Clem's voice outside her window, loud enough to wake her but controlled enough to tell her this was urgent rather than panic. She was outside in 40 seconds, pulling on her boots as she went. Fence is down, Clem said. He was holding a lantern and his face in the light was the particular flat kind of calm that meant he was working very hard to stay that way. East section. The temporary lines we ran for the rotation. Somebody cut them in at least 3 places. I found it on the midnight check. How many head are loose? Hard to say in the dark. Most of the herd was bedded in the West Basin when I checked at 8. If they moved east during the night... He stopped. She grabbed the lantern from him. Get Pete. Get Roscoe if he's in the bunkhouse. Bring rope and your cutting tools. Rowan. He used her first name, which he almost never did. The east section backs up to the canyon draw. She stopped. The canyon draw was what Clem called it. A deep, rocky cut in the terrain at the southeastern corner of the property. A half-mile of broken ground and ledge drops that was the one section of the ranch she kept the cattle away from deliberately, because it was exactly the kind of terrain that Longhorns, for all their competence, could get themselves killed in if they went in spooked and moving fast. How far east was the cut fence? She asked. Closest section was maybe 300 yards from the draw. 300 yards. In the dark, with the cattle already potentially in motion, with the terrain rolling and unfamiliar at speed. Get the horses, she said. All 3. And wake Pete now. They rode east into the dark with the lanterns as low as they dared. Enough light to see the ground, not enough to spook anything that might be standing nervous in the grass ahead. The wind had come up in the last hour, which was the worst possible development. Wind made cattle edgy, and edgy cattle in unfamiliar terrain in the dark was exactly the combination that ended badly. They found the first cut fence within 5 minutes of riding. Clean cuts, wire snipped at the post, same methodology as the fence tampering months ago, but faster and wider. Clem counted 7 cut sections before they stopped counting and spread out. The cattle were moving. She could hear them before she saw them. The particular sound of a herd not quite at full run, but not settled either. The low rumble of hooves on dry ground and the occasional clash of horn against brush. She pushed her horse faster. Pete found the main group first and called out to her. 30 yards to the south, maybe 15 head moving northeast in a loose cluster, and northeast was toward the canyon draw. She cut around to the left to get ahead of them, riding harder than she should have in the dark, trusting her horse's footing on ground they'd covered 100 times in daylight. She got ahead of them, barely. She pulled up broadside to the leading cattle and her horse, a steady bay gelding named Cutter that she'd brought from Cutter's Bend and trusted absolutely, held his ground without being asked, while the leading edge of the cattle cluster hit the line and balked. 3 of them pushed around her right side and she let them go. They were heading south, away from the draw, which was fine, and held the rest with her horse's body and the sound of her voice, low and steady, the kind of voice that said nothing in particular but said it calmly. It took. The cluster slowed. It didn't stop. You couldn't stop 15 moving cattle with 1 horse and 1 person in the dark, but it slowed enough that when Clem came up on the right flank and Pete pushed in from the south, They had a working triangle around the group and could start moving them away from the canyon. It was 2 more hours of work in the dark. 2 hours of slow, careful, exhausting work, moving cattle that didn't want to be moved, in terrain that she knew but couldn't fully see, with 3 people where she really needed 6 and equipment that had been deliberately sabotaged to create exactly this situation. She fell once. Her horse sidestepped a ground squirrel hole, and she went off the left side and hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of her, and she lay there for a few seconds in the dry grass, looking up at the stars, while her body remembered how to breathe. She got up. She found her horse. She kept working. By the time the sky started going gray in the east, they had 26 of the herd back in the West Basin. Clem and Pete were still out looking for the rest. She counted twice to make sure, and then sat down on the fence rail and put her head in her hands. Not from despair, just from the weight of the last 4 hours finally having somewhere to land. She heard hoofbeats. She lifted her head. Clem was coming in from the east, and behind him, moving at a slow, tired walk that said they'd run themselves out and were done, were 4 more cattle. One of them was Duchess, the big brindle cow, horns catching the early light, looking no more ruffled than if she'd spent the night in a comfortable barn. "That's 30, Clem said, pulling up. "I found these 4 at the edge of the brush line near the draw. Close." He looked at her. "Too close." "But not in," she said. "Not in," he agreed. She let that settle. 30 out of what had been 29 confirmed head before the calves, plus the 3 calves, so 32 total. She was still missing 2 animals. "We'll find the other 2 in daylight," she said. "Patch the fences first. Whatever it takes." Clem dismounted and led his horse toward the water trough. He stopped and looked back at her. She must have looked as bad as she felt, because his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite concern. Clem wasn't a man who expressed concern directly, but was adjacent to it. "You went off your horse," he said. "I got back on." "There's blood on your face." She touched her forehead. Her hand came away with a smear of dried blood from where she'd hit the ground. She hadn't noticed. "I'll clean it up." "You should." "I'll clean it up, Clem." She said it without sharpness, but with the finality that meant the conversation was over. He nodded and kept walking. They found the 2 missing cattle by mid-morning. Both of them had gone through a gap in the northwestern fence and were standing calmly in the dry wash on the far side, grazing on nothing in particular, seemingly unbothered by the night's events. Pete herded them back with the weary relief of someone who had expected worse and was choosing to be grateful for what he got. Roscoe Fitch arrived at the ranch at noon without explanation, looked at the state of things, and started immediately on fence repair. Nobody asked him. He just started, and after a moment Pete went and helped him, and that was the end of that. Rowan spent the morning hours cleaning up the documentation of what had happened. She walked every cut fence section and noted the location, the cut method, the direction of cattle movement it would have produced. She wrote it all down in the ledger, dated and timed as precisely as she could reconstruct. She sketched a rough map showing where each cut was relative to the canyon draw and the barn and the water sources. Clem found her at it when he came back from the north boundary check and stood over her shoulder reading what she'd written. "You're building a record," he said. "I'm building a case," she said. "There's a difference." "What does the case show?" She looked at what she'd written. "It shows that someone cut fence at 7 separate points, specifically on the east sections closest to the canyon draw, specifically in a pattern that would push a moving herd in one direction. It wasn't random. It wasn't theft this time. They weren't trying to take the cattle. They were trying to run them into the draw." Clem said nothing for a moment. Outside, the sound of Roscoe and Pete working the fence wire was steady and rhythmic. "That's different from stealing cattle," he said, finally. "Yes," she said, "it is. Killing cattle was different from stealing them. You didn't kill livestock to take their value. You killed them to end someone's operation, to take something that couldn't be insured or replaced easily, in a way that couldn't be definitively proven, in a region where a canyon accident was just a canyon accident." She sealed the ledger entry and started a new letter to Harmon Bryce, the lawyer in Cutter's Bend. Bryce came out to the ranch 4 days later, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought she would need to go to him, and the fact that he rode out himself told her something. He was a slim, quiet man in his 60s with careful eyes and a methodical way of speaking that she found immediately reassuring, not because he was warm, but because he was precise. He read through everything she had: the original boundary documents, the county records copy, the grazing claim filing from 11 years back, both letters to Crane, and the ledger, all of it, from the first week to the cut fences 3 nights ago. He took his time. He made notes in a small book of his own. When he was done, he closed the ledger and set it on the table and looked at her. "You've been very organized about this," he said. "I didn't know what else to be." "It's the right instinct." He tapped the county document copy. "This grazing claim Garrett filed. This is the piece that matters most legally. It was filed improperly on land that existing surveys show clearly belongs to this property. That's not ambiguous. The fact that it's been sitting in county records for 11 years without challenge doesn't legitimize it. Can I have it removed?" "You can file for a formal declaration of invalidity. It takes time, but given the documentation you have, I think the outcome is relatively clear." He paused. "The other incidents, the water line, the fence cutting, are harder to prosecute without direct evidence connecting them to a specific party, but they're part of a pattern, and patterns are useful in civil proceedings even when they're not sufficient for criminal ones." What would a civil proceeding accomplish? Potentially, compensation for damages. More importantly, a formal legal record that makes any future action more costly for whoever is behind this. He looked at her steadily. "Right now, they're operating with low risk. If you establish that you're building toward litigation, the calculus changes." "How much does that cost me?" He named a figure. It was more than she had and less than she'd feared. "I can give you half now," she said. "Half in 60 days. "That's acceptable," he said, without any indication that the arrangement was unusual. She walked him out to his horse, and he was mounting up when he paused and looked back at her. "Miss Hale," he said, "the people doing this to you, they're not worried about the cattle. They're worried about what you're building. If they were just trying to wait you out, they would wait. They're not waiting." "I know," she said. "Someone told me something similar a few months ago." "Then you understand that the most important thing you can do right now is not to give them a reason to escalate further. Hold your ground, build your record, and let me do the work that I do." He adjusted his hat. "Don't ride onto Garrett's land. Don't confront Whitmore directly. Don't give them anything they can use." "I understand." He nodded and rode out. Samuel Draper's employer arrived 11 days after Draper's visit, on a bright, dry morning that smelled like dust and something approaching fall. His name was Callahan, Marcus Callahan, a broad, straight-backed man in his mid-50s who had made his money in cattle years ago and had spent the last decade doing something more complicated with it that Draper described vaguely as investment and trade. He had the air of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone and had found that restful. He arrived with Draper and one other man and spent the first hour saying almost nothing, just walking the property and looking at things the way Draper had. But slower, with the unhurried attention of a man who had already seen everything Draper's report contained and was checking it against his own instincts. He stopped at the South Basin and watched the herd for a long time. Rowan stood beside him and let him watch. She'd learned by now that speaking into silence was usually a mistake. "Your manager's report mentioned fence damage," Callahan said finally. "We had some fence cutting in the east section about 10 days ago. The fences are repaired." "What caused the cutting?" She looked at him. "Someone who doesn't want this operation to succeed." He turned slightly and looked at her with the specific quality of attention that meant he was assessing something other than what he'd just heard. "And yet, here you are." "Here I am," she said. "Draper said your rotation records are the most systematic he's seen outside of an operation 3 times your size." "I didn't know what the standard was. I just kept track of what I was doing." "That's the standard," he said. He watched the cattle for another moment. Duchess had moved to the front of the grazing line, as she always did, and was working a patch of regrowth on the eastern edge of the basin with the same methodical authority she brought to everything. "That brindle cow," Callahan said. "She a leader? Or just pushy?" "Both," Rowan said. "But she earns it. The herd follows her because she's right more often than not." He made a sound that might have been amusement. I want 6 calves to start, he said. Whatever you have ready in the next 2 months. Fair market price plus a quality premium. Because Draper's right that what you're producing is above current regional standard. He paused. And I'd like to discuss an ongoing arrangement, first right of purchase on future calves, at a price structure we'd agree to now. She made herself breathe normally. I'd want that in writing, she said. So would I, he said. They went inside and sat at her kitchen table and spent 2 hours working out the terms. And when they were done, she had a signed purchase agreement for 6 calves at a price that would cover Bryce's retainer, clear most of what she owed Osman, and leave her with enough operating margin to get through the next 4 months without the constant arithmetic of disaster. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even security. Not yet. But it was real, and it was hers, and she had built it from nothing. After Callahan and Draper rode out, she sat at the kitchen table alone for a while. The house was quiet. Through the window, she could see Pete working the fence line on the far corral, and the late afternoon light was doing what it sometimes did in the Texas fall, going gold and long and making even the beaten-up, patched-together structures of the ranch look like something worth having. Clem appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face and read what was there. Good? He said. Good enough, she said. For now. He nodded once and went back outside, and she heard him telling Pete something in a low voice. And a moment later, Pete made a sound that was almost a whoop and then cut it off, probably remembering that it wasn't his moment. She opened the ledger. She wrote down the date, the terms, and the number of calves committed. Then she wrote in her small, precise handwriting a single line below the entry, first contract, not the last. Outside, the windmill turned. The herd moved in the gold light, and in the county records office in Red Rock, a letter from Harmon Bryce was sitting in the incoming tray, requesting formal review of a fraudulent grazing claim. A quiet, legal piece of paper that would, in the weeks to come, begin to make certain powerful men very uncomfortable indeed. Harmon Bryce's letter to the county land office produced results in the way that legal documents sometimes did. Slowly, then all at once. For the first 3 weeks after he filed the formal request for boundary review and declaration of invalidity on Garrett's grazing claim, nothing visible happened. The county moved at the pace it always moved, which was the pace of a bureaucracy staffed by people who had other things to do and no particular urgency about any of them. Rowan knew this and planned around it, focusing on what she could control while Bryce worked the process she couldn't. She delivered the 6 calves to Callahan's operation. Draper came with a trailer and 2 hands to collect them, professional and efficient, and left her with a bank draft that she folded once and put in her coat pocket and didn't look at again until she was alone that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up for once, letting herself feel the full weight of what that piece of paper meant. She paid Osman first, rode into Perdido Wells the next morning and settled the credit account in full, which produced from Osman the specific expression of a man who had extended trust and had it returned and found that satisfying in a way that went beyond the money. You didn't have to come in person, he said. You extended me credit when you didn't have to, she said. Coming in person seemed right. He waved that off, but she could see it meant something to him. He walked her to the door when she left, which he didn't do with everyone. Word's getting around, he said as she stepped out, about what you're doing out there. She paused. What kind of word? The kind where people are starting to ask questions instead of making predictions. He leaned against the door frame. Henderson came in last week, asked me if I knew what rotation system you were using on the grazing. I told him I didn't know the details. He should ask you himself. She thought about that on the ride back. Henderson was one of the ranchers who'd lost a third of his herd earlier in the drought. One of the names Pete had reported when relaying what people were saying about her chances. The same Henderson who'd said she'd be sold out by fall. Fall had come and gone. She was still here. Thus, the county boundary review came back in the 4th week, and it came back in her favor. Bryce rode out to deliver the news himself, which told her it was significant. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with the document in front of him and walked her through it in his careful, methodical way. The county surveyor had reviewed the original land records, the Hale property survey, and Garrett's grazing claim filing. The conclusion was unambiguous. The claim had been filed on land that fell inside the established Hale property boundary. The claim was declared invalid and struck from the county records. "What does Garrett do now?" she asked. "He can contest it," Bryce said. "He has 30 days to file a formal objection. If he does, we go to a hearing, and at a hearing, the documentation you've assembled over the past several months becomes directly relevant." He paused. "I've also submitted to the county clerk the full record of incidents, the fence cutting, the water line blockage, the missing cattle. It doesn't trigger a criminal investigation on its own, but it's on file. It's dated, and Garrett knows it's there. And Whitmore. Whitmore's involvement is harder to document directly, but Whitmore is a man who calculates risk carefully. He'll know that the legal landscape has shifted." Bryce gathered his papers. "I expect you'll hear from Garrett within the week. I don't expect it will be pleasant, but I expect it will be his last move rather than one of many." He was right on both counts. Garrett came 5 days later, and he came alone again, and this time he didn't bother with the pretense of boundary disputes or property surveys. He rode up to the gate, and she met him there, and they stood in the thin winter sunlight and had the most direct conversation they'd ever had. "You went to a lawyer," he said. "I did. That grazing claim was legitimate. I've been using that land for years." "Using land doesn't establish ownership," she said. "The county agrees with me. You have 30 days to file an objection if you disagree with their finding." His jaw worked. He was not a man who lost things often, and the experience of losing this particular thing quietly, through documentation and process, without a confrontation he could respond to directly, was visible on his face as something between anger and bafflement. "I didn't cut your fences," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time he'd mentioned the fences, which told her something. "I didn't say you did," she said carefully. "People are saying things," he said in town, "that I've been working against your operation." "Have you?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Not a confession. He'd never confess, and she wasn't looking for one, but an acknowledgement of something they both knew without either of them needing to say it plainly. "The missing cattle," she said. 11 head. I'd like them back, or fair market value." He looked at her for a long, hard moment. Then he looked away, out across the flat scrubland toward the horizon. "Market value," he said, through Bryce. "That's acceptable," she said. He rode out without another word. A week later, Bryce received a payment from Garrett's attorney. Fair market value for 11 Longhorn cattle, delivered without accompanying documentation or explanation. Rowan deposited it and added the entry to her ledger and did not discuss it with anyone outside the ranch. The winter that year was mild by Texas standards, which after the drought felt almost excessive in its generosity. Rain came in December. Not flooding, not dramatic, just steady, quiet rain over 3 days that soaked into the cracked earth and stayed there. Rowan stood on the porch of the main house on the second morning of it and watched the rain fall on the basin and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since she'd arrived. The East Basin, which she'd been rotating carefully for 6 months, responded to the rain the way good land responds when it's been given time to recover. Quickly, and with a thoroughness that surprised even her. Within 3 weeks of the rain, there was grass coming back across sections that had looked terminally dry. Real grass, deep-rooted, the kind that would hold through the next dry stretch better than before because the soil structure was recovering. She walked it with Clem one afternoon in early January, both of them moving through the new growth in the low winter light, and Clem crouched down at one point and pulled up a handful of the soil and held it and looked at it with the expression of a man who had been working land long enough to know what good soil felt like. "Different," he said, "from when I came. From 10 years ago." He let the soil fall. "Your grandfather had the right idea, just didn't have the time." "He had the time," she said. "He didn't have the fight left." Clem stood and brushed his hand on his knee. "You've got enough fight for both of you," he said, which from Clem was about as close to a compliment as a person was going to get, and she took it as such. Henderson showed up without warning in the second week of January. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a sunburned face and the hands of someone who had worked cattle his whole life and hadn't softened in any way that showed. He arrived at the gate in the mid-morning and asked to speak to her, and there was something in the way he asked, not quite humble, because she suspected Henderson didn't do humble, but stripped of the casual authority he probably used in most conversations, that told her this wasn't a social visit. She brought him inside and put coffee on, because the day was cold enough that it was the right thing to do, regardless of who was asking for her time. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and looked around at the modest, working clean interior of the house before he looked at her. "I heard about the boundary ruling," he said, "and the settlement from Garrett." Word traveled fast in a county this small. "That's right," she said. "I also heard Callahan's people were out here, that you've got a contract with his operation." "I do." Henderson nodded slowly. He turned his hat in his hands once. "I lost 400 head this past year," he said, "between the drought and the feed costs and a disease problem we had in the summer. I've still got 600, but—" He stopped. "I've been running Herefords for 30 years. My father ran Herefords. I know everything there is to know about running Herefords, and it's not working anymore. The land I've got can't support them the way it used to, and I don't have the water security to get through another bad stretch." She poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him. "What are you asking, Mr. Henderson?" He looked at her directly. It was the first time he'd done that, she realized. Actually looked at her directly rather than in the general direction of her. "I want to know how you're doing what you're doing. The rotation system, the Longhorn management. I want to understand it well enough to try it." She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup. She thought about it honestly, about what it would cost her to share what she knew, what it might mean for her own competitive position, whether there was a version of this conversation that wasn't in her interest. She couldn't find one. Henderson's land was northeast of hers, not competitive range. His success or failure didn't affect her herd or her contracts, and the thing she'd built over the past several months wasn't a secret that could be kept anyway. It was a method, visible to anyone who paid attention, already being partially replicated by Ida Voss. "It's not complicated," she said. "That's the thing people don't believe when I tell them. Try me." She talked for an hour. She walked him through the rotation system, the rest periods, the logic behind letting the land recover, rather than trying to force production from depleted soil. She explained what she'd observed about Longhorn grazing behavior, what they sought, how they moved, why their efficiency in low-resource environments wasn't a bug, but a deeply bred feature that had been systematically ignored in favor of breeds that produced more weight in better conditions. She got the ledger out and showed him the before and after land condition records, the cattle health observations, the month-by-month progression of the East Basin from near-dead to productive. Henderson listened with the focused silence of a man making real decisions in real time. He asked questions that were precise and practical, not skeptical questions meant to poke holes, but the questions of someone trying to understand well enough to do the work. When she was done, he sat for a moment looking at the open ledger. "How many Longhorns do you have now?" he asked. 34 confirmed head, she said, plus the calves expected in spring. The herd's been building steadily. "Could you sell me breeding stock, 6 cows, maybe 2 bulls?" She'd been expecting something like this, and she'd thought about how to answer it. "In the spring," she said, "after the next calving. I can sell you stock at that point without compromising my own numbers." "Price?" She named a figure. It was fair. Above standard Longhorn market price, but not aggressively so, in line with what Callahan had paid and justified by the documented health records she could provide. He didn't haggle. He just nodded. "I'll want it in writing," he said. "So will I," she said. He stood and put his hat back on, and then he stood there for a second in the way of a man who had something else to say and hadn't decided yet if he was going to say it. "I told people last summer you wouldn't make it to fall," he said. "I know. I was wrong." She looked at him. There was nothing comfortable about the way he said it. It wasn't a gracious apology. It was just a flat acknowledgement of a fact. She respected that more than graciousness would have been. "Spring," she said. "Bring your paperwork and I'll have mine ready." He nodded and left. Ida Voss came in February with her husband, a quiet, careful man named Theo, who let Ida do the talking and clearly thought this was the right arrangement. Ida's Longhorn crosses had made it through the winter in condition that her straight Angus hadn't, and she'd spent 3 months refining what she'd learned from Rowan into something that fit her own land and operation. She came not to ask questions this time, but to share what she'd observed, a reciprocal exchange that Rowan found she valued more than she'd expected. They sat at the kitchen table for most of an afternoon while Theo and Clem walked the property together outside, and Ida spread out her own version of a land record, less systematic than Rowan's but honest and detailed, and they compared notes the way two people do when they've been running parallel experiments and want to know what the other found. The crosses behave differently from pure Longhorns, Ida said. More like the Angus in some ways. They want more water, they don't range as independently, but their drought tolerance is significantly better than straight Angus. The proportion matters, Rowan said. What's your cross ratio? Roughly half. We bought from a man who wasn't tracking it carefully, so I'm estimating. If you breed the crosses back to a Longhorn bull next season, you'll get something closer to 3/4 Longhorn in the next generation. That's where the range behavior really comes through, I think. She paused. I've been meaning to test this systematically, but I don't have the numbers yet. We could, Ida said. Between your herd and mine, we'd have enough to track it properly. Rowan looked at her. It was a reasonable proposition, sharing data across two operations to build a picture that neither could build alone. What would you want in return? Same thing you're getting, Ida said. Better information. They worked out the arrangement over the next hour. What they'd each track, how often they'd share notes, what counted as proprietary to each operation, and what was shared research. Theo came back inside partway through and listened to the last portion of it with the expression of a man watching his wife conduct a business negotiation and finding no reason to interfere. When they were leaving, Ida stopped at the door. I heard Henderson came to see you, she said. He did. And two other ranchers, apparently. Word gets around. It does. Ida looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. When we first met, you were 3 months from losing everything, she said. I don't know if you remember what that felt like, but I do. I was watching it and wondering if I should say anything. You said the right things, Rowan said. I said what I saw. Ida pulled her coat tighter against the February cold. What I see now is different. She rode out with Theo through the gate, and Rowan stood in the yard and watched them go, sad. The letter from Whitmore came in March. Not a visit this time. A letter, delivered through his lawyer, addressed to her formally, and written in the careful language of a man communicating through legal intermediaries. It acknowledged the county boundary ruling. It expressed, in the measured language of the letter, that Mr. Whitmore wished to resolve any outstanding matters related to the neighboring properties in a spirit of regional cooperation. It proposed a meeting. She read it 3 times. Then she brought it to Bryce. Bryce read it once and set it down. He's pulling back, he said. Why? Several reasons, probably. The Garrett settlement established a legal record that implicates a pattern of interference with your operation. Garrett himself has gone quiet, which suggests he's been advised to. Whitmore's exposure, if someone were to start pulling on the thread of who coordinated what, across the fence cutting and the bank appraisal and the supplier pressure, is real enough that continuing to push against you is a worse bet than leaving you alone. He paused. And you're no longer a failing operation that will conveniently disappear. You have a contract with Callahan, a pending sale agreement with Henderson, and a documented recovery on the land. The calculation has changed. He wants the meeting to make peace, she said. He wants the meeting to make sure you're not going to pursue litigation that costs him money and reputation. Bryce looked at her. Are you? She thought about it. About the 11 cattle, the water line, the cut fences, the canyon draw, and the night she'd gone off her horse in the dark. About the bank appraisal that had been designed to fail her. About all the small, deliberate things that had been done to make sure she didn't make it. Not if he leaves me alone, she said. That's a pragmatic answer. It's the honest one, she said. I didn't start this to punish people. I started it to build something. Bryce nodded. I'll arrange the meeting. The meeting with Whitmore was held at a neutral location, the back room of a hotel in Cutter's Bend that Bryce arranged on a cold, bright morning in late March. Whitmore arrived with his lawyer. Rowan arrived with Bryce. They sat across a table from each other for the first time in months, and she found that the man across from her looked marginally older than she remembered, or maybe just more tired in the way of someone who had been managing a situation that hadn't gone the way he intended. He expressed regret for any misunderstandings. He used that word, misunderstandings, and she let it pass without comment because the word didn't matter. His lawyer presented a document. It was a formal agreement to cease any actions that might be construed as interference with the Hale property operation, in exchange for a release of any claims Rowan might bring against Whitmore interests. The release was limited in scope. It didn't cover Garrett. It didn't cover anything already in the county record, but it covered Whitmore directly. She read it carefully. Bryce read it more carefully. They stepped out into the hotel hallway for 5 minutes. "It's reasonable," Bryce said quietly. "It doesn't give you everything, but it gives you protection and resolution against the biggest actor." "What am I giving up?" "The ability to sue Whitmore personally. Given the difficulty of proving his direct involvement in any specific incident, what you'd be giving up is mostly theoretical." She thought about Harv Osman saying a man who was sure you'd fail would just wait. She thought about what she'd built in the months since, what was still being built, what needed to be protected, and what was already protected by the existence of the legal record alone. "I'll sign it," she said. She signed it at the table with Whitmore watching, and he signed it across from her, and his lawyer collected the documents, and that was the end of it. No handshake. Whitmore nodded once with the minimal courtesy of a man settling an account, and left with his lawyer. Rowan and Bryce walked out of the hotel into the March morning. "That's done," Bryce said. "That part of it," she said. She rode home that afternoon through country that looked, she thought, different than it had when she'd first made this trip 8 months ago. Not physically different. The scrub and the pale clay and the long flat distances were all exactly the same, but different in the way a landscape looks when you've stopped being afraid of it, when you've stopped asking if you belong in it and started just belonging. Spring came early, and the calving season was the best she'd had. 11 calves, which doubled what she'd seen the previous year, and vindicated, in the most concrete possible way, the condition of the herd she'd been building. Clem moved through the calving season with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this work for decades and knew exactly what needed attention and what needed to be left alone. And Pete had developed, over the past year, a real feel for the cattle. Not just for the mechanics of the work, but for the animals themselves, the way they moved, what they were telling you when they moved that way. Roscoe Fitch was on full payroll now. She'd made it official in February, with a wage that was modest but real, because he'd kept showing up without being asked for long enough that asking him to leave would have been the stranger choice. He didn't talk much. He worked well, and he was honest about what he didn't know, which was its own kind of quality. Henderson came in April for the breeding stock he'd contracted for. 6 cows and a young bull, all documented with full health records and the lineage notes she'd been building since her first weeks on the ranch. He brought his foreman with him to collect the animals, and the foreman walked each one with the critical eye of someone who was going to have to make this work back on Henderson's land and wanted to know what he was getting. "These are good animals," the foreman said, to no one in particular watching the bull she'd named. Only in her ledger, Ajax moved through the temporary pen. Henderson was watching too. He glanced at her. "Your grandfather collected the original herd?" "He did," she said. "He didn't know quite what he had." "Did you? When you got here?" She thought about it honestly. "I knew they were still alive when everything else had failed," she said. "That seemed worth paying attention to." Henderson made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close to one. He handed his foreman the paperwork, and they loaded the animals and left, and she stood in the yard watching the trailer roll down the 2-track road toward the main route, and felt the absence of those 6 cattle and the bull in the way you feel any honest exchange, knowing what you gave up and knowing what you got for it. 2 weeks after Henderson's visit, a rancher named Corrigan came from the south end of the county. Then a woman named Mrs. Beaumont, who ran a small operation with her adult son, came asking about calves. Then a man called Prentice, who worked 50 acres of marginal land east of Perdido Wells, came to ask about the rotation system specifically. He hadn't purchased any Longhorns yet, couldn't afford to, but wanted to understand the land management approach and whether it would help what he had. She showed Prentice what she could show him without selling him anything, walking the basin sections and explaining the rest period logic, pointing at the visible difference between the areas that had been rotated and the sections she'd used as comparison ground. He stood at the edge of the East Basin and looked at the grass with the expression of someone seeing something they hadn't expected to see. "I've been looking at this land wrong," he said. "Most people have," she said, "including me at the start." He came back a month later with his son, and then he came back again, and eventually he managed to buy 2 Longhorn cows from a neighbor who'd acquired some on a trade and didn't know what to do with them. And he started the process in his own small way, with her advice when he needed it. She didn't charge Prentice for her time. She thought about it. Bryce would have told her to, probably, but she didn't. Prentice couldn't afford to pay for it, and what he was going to learn would cost her nothing to share. The version of herself that had arrived on this property 8 months ago, frightened and cash poor, and surrounded by people who expected her to fail, had received something from Harv Osman and Ida Voss, and in his own oblique way, from Clem. That debt didn't transfer, but it informed what she did with what she had now. The ledger she'd started in her first week on the ranch was full. The second one was 3/4 full. She started a third. The third ledger felt different in her hands. Not lighter, not heavier, but different in the way a tool feels once you've used it long enough that it's shaped itself to your hand. She opened it to the first page and wrote the date and the current herd count at the top. 41 confirmed head, 11 spring calves, 3 contracted for Callahan's next collection, 6 already delivered to Henderson, pending inquiry from 2 additional buyers. Below that she wrote the current land condition assessment, the East Basin, the north section above the draw, the West Flat, the far south corner she'd only recently been able to start rotating cattle through. Each section described in the shorthand she'd developed over months. The language of someone who had learned to read a specific piece of land through direct, repeated attention. Clem knocked on the open door of the house. She looked up. "There's a man at the gate," he said. "Young fellow. Says he's looking for work and heard this was a place worth coming to." She thought about that. A place worth coming to. And what it meant that someone had heard that. "Send him in," she said. "I'll talk to him." She closed the ledger and stood up and went outside into the spring afternoon, where the East Basin was greener than it had been since before her grandfather's hand started shaking, and the herd moved through it with the unhurried confidence of animals that had been given what they needed and were doing what they were built to do. The man at the gate was young, maybe 22, with the look of someone who had ridden a long way and was trying not to show it. He was holding his hat and looking around the property with the assessing eyes of someone who'd seen enough bad operations to recognize when he was looking at something different. "You're Miss Hale?" he said. "I am," she said. He looked at the herd. He looked at the land. He looked at her. "They said in Perdido Wells that this was the place to come if you wanted to learn something worth learning," he said. "I'm a hard worker and I'm honest about what I don't know. I'm asking for a chance." She studied him for a moment. He didn't flinch from it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Dawes," he said. "Cal Dawes." "You know cattle, Cal?" "Some. Not Longhorn specifically. Nobody does when they get here," she said. "That's not necessarily a problem." She looked at him for another beat. "You'll work for a month on trial wages. If you're what you say you are, we'll talk about something permanent." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Put your horse in the East Corral. Clem will show you the bunkhouse." She turned toward the house. "And Dawes, the learning here goes both ways. You see something I'm not seeing, you say so. That's not optional, it's part of the job." She went back inside to write it down. Cal Dawes lasted longer than the trial month. He lasted 3 years. He turned out to be exactly what he'd claimed at the gate, a hard worker, honest about what he didn't know, and genuinely observant in a way that wasn't common in young men who hadn't yet learned that watching was more useful than talking. By his second month, he'd noticed something about the northeast corner of the property that nobody had flagged before. A section of soil with a different composition than the surrounding flat, darker and with more clay content that held moisture longer after rain. He mentioned it to Rowan the way she'd told him to, directly, without preamble, and she went and looked at it and stood there for a while and then added it to the ledger and adjusted the rotation schedule to take advantage of it. "Good catch," she told him. "Just walked it enough times," he said, and went back to what he'd been doing. That was the texture of those years. Not a single dramatic turning point, but an accumulation of small, precise improvements, each one small enough to seem minor in isolation and collectively amounting to something that changed what the land was capable of producing. The East Basin that had shown tentative new growth in her first autumn was, 3 years later, producing grass through dry stretches that would have killed it before. The rotation system had been refined through 4 full cycles into something nearly intuitive. Clem could run it without a written schedule now, adjusting based on what he saw rather than what the calendar said, which was the point she'd been aiming for from the beginning. The herd had grown to 87 head by the end of the 3rd year. 87 Longhorns documented and registered, with breeding records going back to the original 30-some-odd animals her grandfather had kept alive through the last of his difficult years. She knew the lineage of every animal in the herd well enough to cite it without the ledger, which she'd long since transferred into a formal record book that Bryce had helped her structure properly for commercial documentation purposes. Callahan's operation in San Antonio had received 4 separate deliveries of calves and young stock by that point, and Marcus Callahan had become, in the understated way of men who communicated primarily through continued business, something close to a reliable partner. He didn't praise her work effusively, he just kept coming back. Henderson's operation had stabilized, not transformed overnight, because nothing in ranching happened overnight, but his Longhorn crosses were working the way she'd predicted, carrying condition through conditions that his straight Herefords couldn't sustain, and his land in the northeast quadrant of the county was showing the same slow recovery that her own land had shown once the rotation system gave it room to breathe. He came by twice a year, roughly, and each visit was less about asking questions and more about comparing notes, the way people do when they've both done the work and have something to compare. Ida Voss's operation had grown more than anyone expected, including Ida. The combined data they'd been sharing across 2 seasons had produced something genuinely useful, a clearer picture of how Longhorn cross ratios affected grazing behavior and drought resilience, documented well enough that it was no longer just a practical observation, but an argument you could make to someone who hadn't seen it. Ida had written it up in her own careful way and shared it with a ranching association contact in Dallas, and the association had published it in their quarterly journal in a small article that neither of them had expected, and both of them found slightly bewildering. Rowan didn't read her own name in that article without a complicated feeling. Not pride exactly, because pride implied you'd expected something and gotten it, and she'd never let herself expect much. More like recognition. The recognition of someone who has worked in a specific direction for a long time and has arrived, without ceremony, at a place they can identify on a map. Seeing. The 4th spring brought a drought again. Not as severe as the one she'd arrived in, but bad enough. The creek beds went dry by June. The regional water situation tightened the way it always did in dry years, with the old anxieties surfacing in conversations at Osmond's store and the feed supply in Perdido Wells and anywhere else ranchers gathered. Talk of selling off stock, reducing herd size, waiting it out. Rowan's herd came through it with less intervention than she'd needed even 2 years prior. The land they'd been building was different now. The soil structure, the root systems, the accumulated biomass from years of rotational grazing, all of it contributing to a resilience that wasn't magic and wasn't luck, but was the product of accumulated patient decision-making over time. The Longhorns found what they needed the way they always did, ranging further when they had to, adapting their grazing patterns without being pushed into it, doing the thing they'd been doing for 100 years in this country before people decided they were obsolete. She still lost animals that summer. 3 head to heat stress in a bad week in August, 2 more to a predator issue on the far south section that took Clem 2 weeks to figure out and resolve. Loss was part of ranching and always would be, and anyone who told you differently was either lying or working with animals made of something other than flesh. She wrote it in the ledger without sentiment and adjusted her projections and kept moving. What she noticed in that difficult 4th summer was who came to her. 3 ranchers she'd never met, from the southern end of the county and 1 from across the county line entirely, rode in over the course of June and July asking the same basic questions Henderson had asked 3 years earlier. One of them was a woman named Gertrude Prawl, 60 years old, who had run her family's ranch alone since her husband died, and who arrived with the direct, no time for anything extra manner of someone who had learned early that circling a subject was a luxury she couldn't afford. I've heard you can get longhorns through a dry summer on marginal land without the losses everyone else is taking, Gertrude said, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee she'd accepted without enthusiasm. I want to know if it's true. It's partly true, Rowan said. The cattle are more resilient. The land management extends that resilience. Neither one works as well without the other. I've got 210 acres of marginal land and no margin for the losses I had last year, Gertrude said. What do I do first? Rowan told her, straightforwardly, without softening it or making it sound simpler than it was. She told Gertrude about the rotation system, about the rest periods, about what to watch for in the soil and what to watch for in the cattle. She told her about the startup difficulty, the months before any of it produces results, the way it required you to do counterintuitive things at exactly the moments when the pressure to do something different was highest. Gertrude listened, asked 3 precise questions, and left with the expression of someone who had gotten what she came for and was already thinking about implementation. She's going to do it, Pete said later. He'd been in the room for most of the conversation, which had become normal. Pete had developed into a real hand over 3 years, had filled out in judgment as much as in physical presence, and she'd found herself including him in conversations she'd once had only with Clem. She is, Rowan agreed. Does it bother you? Everyone learning how to do what you figured out? She thought about it. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. No, she said. The land doesn't care who's managing it well. It just responds to being managed well. She paused. And if every rancher in this county figures out how to work with the land instead of against it, that's not competition for me. That's a different kind of county. Pete was quiet for a moment. You didn't think about this as a business strategy when you started, he said. You were just trying to survive. I was trying to survive, she confirmed. But you can't actually try to survive without thinking about what you're building. Survival and building aren't different things. They're the same thing at different time scales. He chewed on that. That's something Elias probably would have said, he said. Maybe, she said. I didn't know him well enough to be sure, but maybe. In the 5th year, Whitmore's southern operation began to contract. It wasn't dramatic. There was no public collapse, no visible failure. Whitmore was too careful and too well-resourced for that. But the 12,000-acre operation that had once made everything around it feel small began to quietly reduce its footprint. Grazing leases that had been renewed automatically for decades came up for renewal and weren't renewed. A section of his southern range, the section that abutted her northern boundary, was listed for sale. She heard about the sale listing through Bryce, who heard it through his professional channels and brought it to her on a Tuesday afternoon with the careful neutrality of a man presenting information without editorial. It's available, he said. The asking price is high, higher than it should be for the land condition. He knows I might want it, she said. Possibly, or he's testing the market. Bryce set the listing document on the table. The significant thing isn't the price. It's that he's selling. She looked at the document. The parcel was 160 acres along her northern boundary, the same boundary she'd spent months documenting and defending, the same direction Garrett had been pushing before the legal settlement shut that down. 160 acres that would consolidate her northern grazing access, eliminate the boundary tensions that had never fully resolved even after the formal agreements, and expand her rotation capacity by roughly 40%. She sat with the number. It was more than she had in immediate cash. It was manageable if she structured it as a land purchase loan, using the existing Hale property as collateral, which was now, after 5 years of demonstrated productivity and documented revenue, worth considerably more than when Presswick at the Cutter's Bend Bank had declined to lend against it. She went to Presswick. She brought 5 years of ledgers, 5 years of contracts, 5 years of documented land recovery, and herd growth. She sat across from him in the same small office and put the same careful documentation on his desk and made the same kind of case she'd made before. And this time his expression was different. Not the carefully neutral face of a man who had already decided, but the attentive face of someone reading something that was telling him what he needed to know. He approved the loan in 2 weeks. She bought the land in March of the 5th year, on a cold, bright morning that reminded her of nothing in particular and felt, because of that, entirely its own. She signed the documents in Bryce's office and rode home through a landscape that was, in the technical legal sense, about 40% larger than it had been when she'd woken up. She stopped at the north boundary on the way back, the old boundary, the line she'd defended and documented and argued over, and sat her horse at the edge of what was now, officially, the north section of the Hale Ranch, and looked out over the scrub and the clay and the long, flat distances. She didn't feel the particular triumph that the moment might have seemed to call for. What she felt was more like the satisfaction of an equation that had resolved correctly. Not exciting exactly, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from 5 years of arithmetic finally adding up to a number you can use. She rode on home. Clem told her he was retiring in the fall of the 5th year. He told her on a Wednesday evening, leaning against the corral fence the way he'd leaned against things for as long as she'd known him, with the flat calm of a man who had decided something and was reporting it rather than discussing it. "My sister's in San Marcos," he said. "She's been after me to come, and I keep putting it off, and I'm 63 years old, and I don't know how many more times I can tell her I'll come eventually." She looked at him. 14 years he'd worked for Elias, nearly 5 more for her. He'd fixed the pump and rebuilt the fence and dug out a blocked water line and ridden boundary checks through weather that would have kept sensible people inside. And he'd done all of it without complaint and with an honesty about the state of things that she'd come to depend on in a way she didn't fully understand until she was standing here thinking about what the ranch looked like without him. "You've earned it," she said. "I know I have," he said. "Wasn't asking permission." She almost smiled. "No, I know you weren't." He looked out at the herd. The 5th year had brought the count to 102 head, a number that still surprised her sometimes when she saw it written down. The distance from 30-something animals grazing on near-dead land to this. "Pete knows the operation," Clem said. "He knows it as well as I do now. Maybe better in some ways. He's younger and his back doesn't give him trouble." He paused. "Dawes is good too. You've got what you need." "I know," she said. "That doesn't make it easier." He looked at her sideways. "Don't go getting sentimental on me." "I'm not sentimental," she said. "You are a little," he said. "You hide it better than most." She didn't argue that. He wasn't wrong. She paid him everything she owed him, which was considerably more than just the current wages. She'd put together what she considered a fair accounting of his commitment through the hardest years of the operation. The months when she hadn't been able to pay properly, and he'd worked anyway, and she paid him for those months too. He accepted it without argument, which told her he thought it was fair. He left on a Thursday morning in October, with his belongings in 2 bags that were not significantly larger than what Rowan had arrived with 5 years earlier, and he shook Pete's hand and nodded at Dawes and told Roscoe to stop letting the South Trough overflow, which had been an ongoing minor issue. Then he stood in front of Rowan and held out his hand. She shook it. "Elias would have liked to see this," he said. "What you've done with it." She held his hand for a moment. "He knew something was here," she said. "That's why he left it to me." "He knew you were here," Clem said. "That's why he left it to you." He picked up his bags and walked to his horse and rode down the 2-track road without looking back. And she stood in the yard and watched him until the scrub oaks took him, and there was nothing to see but the road and the pale sky above it. The ranch at the end of the 5th year was not what anyone had predicted when she arrived. Not what Whitmore had predicted, not what Garrett had planned for, not what the banks had assessed or what the people of Cutter's Bend had assumed when they watched a young woman ride out toward a failing property with 2 saddlebags and no visible prospects. Not even, entirely, what she had imagined in those first weeks when she'd sat at the kitchen table doing arithmetic by lamplight and trying to see a path from where she was to anywhere worth going. 102 Longhorns on 360 acres of recovering land, more acres now with the addition of the northern section, more head, more documented productivity per acre than any competing operation in the county by the measure that mattered, which was the simple, unglamorous measure of how the land held up over time under pressure. 6 ranch hands, where she'd started with 2. A formal contract relationship with Callahan's San Antonio operation that had provided steady income through 2 drought years and 1 good one. Pending purchase agreements with 4 regional buyers for the spring calving. a land value that the Cutter's Bend Bank, without apparent embarrassment about its earlier assessment, now carried on its books at 3 times the figure they'd cited when declining to lend against it. She sat at the kitchen table one evening in late October, with the third ledger open in front of her, and a fourth one sitting on the shelf waiting to be needed. And she thought about what the sum of it meant. Not the financial sum, though that was real and important and hard won. The other sum. What she'd learned about land was that it wanted to recover. That was the thing nobody told you, and that the evidence didn't support if you only looked at land that had been managed as if its purpose was to be used up. Land left alone recovered. Land managed intelligently recovered faster. Land managed with patience and consistent attention to what it was actually doing, rather than what you needed it to do, could become something better than it had been before the damage. She'd watched it happen under her own feet over 5 years, in a place that everyone around her had written off as beyond saving. What she'd learned about people was similar, in the oblique way that lessons about one thing often turned out to be about something else. The people who'd come to her asking questions, Henderson, Ida Voss, Gertrude Prawl, Prentice with his 2 Longhorn cows and his marginal acres, and the dozen others over 5 years who'd ridden in through her gate with their hats in their hands and their operations in trouble, none of them had needed her to save them. They'd needed information they didn't have and a system they could adapt to their own land and their own circumstances. What she gave them was the same thing Elias had tried to give her through a shaky-handed letter, and a herd of cattle that everyone else had stopped believing in. The evidence that something people had written off was actually still working, still viable, still worth believing in if you were willing to look at it without the weight of everyone else's expectations. She didn't know if that constituted a legacy. The word felt too large and too final for something that was still ongoing, still imperfect, still subject to the next drought and the next pressure and the next thing she hadn't anticipated. But she knew it was real. A knock at the door. She called for them to come in, and it was Pete, holding a piece of paper with the look of someone trying to decide if the news on it was good or complicated. "Letter from Callahan's man Draper," he said. "They want to increase the spring order, double what we did last year." She looked at him. "Can we fill it?" he asked. She thought through the current count, the projected calving numbers, what she could move without compromising the herd's growth trajectory. It was tight. It was doable. "Yes," she said. "Tell Draper yes." Pete nodded and started for the door. "Pete." He stopped. She looked at him. The gangly 19-year-old who'd almost left for Garrett's operation had become a steady, capable 24-year-old who knew this land as well as anyone alive, and who had a stake in it now, on paper, the way she'd promised. "You're running the spring calving season," she said. "Primary responsibility. Your call on day-to-day decisions. I'll be here, but it's yours." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You sure?" "You've been doing the work for 2 years," she said. "Time the title caught up." He nodded once, the way Clem used to nod when something was settled. "All right," he said, and went out. She turned back to the ledger and picked up her pen. Outside, the windmill turned in the October dark the same way it had turned on the first night she'd sat at this table with a dead man's letter and a property everyone expected to fail, and $73 to her name. The same rhythmic sound, the same dry wind moving through the mesquite, the same Texas sky with its extravagant stars overhead. The difference was not in those things. The difference was in what she knew now that she hadn't known then. Not certainty, because certainty was something she'd stopped believing in during the first hard months and never picked back up. But knowledge. The specific earned knowledge of someone who had stayed in a difficult place long enough to understand it, and in understanding it had changed what it was capable of becoming. Elias had known something was possible here. He'd held on to it in the only way available to him at the end. By keeping 30-some-odd Longhorns alive on land everyone else had given up on, leaving behind the stubbornest possible evidence that he hadn't stopped believing even when he'd run out of the strength to act on it. She'd acted on it for him and for herself. And now, in the small, expanding way of things that start with one person doing one specific thing well, for every rancher in the county who had come through her gate asking how. She wrote the date at the top of a new ledger page. She wrote the herd count. She wrote the Callahan order confirmation and the projected spring numbers and the current land condition assessment for each rotation section. Then she closed the book, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do. There was always work to do, and that, she had come to understand, was not the burden it had once seemed. It was the whole point.